cast light on darkness, or for that matter, the human condition, is no small feat, but it is what great writers do, and it is what Joyce Carol Oates does. She also often writes of human endurance and hope, and she writes and writes and writes. Novels, plays, short stories, poetry, essays, children's literature, and she finds time somehow also to teach at Princeton, to run about an hour a day, I'm told, and when it suits her. And who else would do this? Even watch movies of Joe Louis boxing. We're very fortunate indeed to have with us this evening one of our nation's preeminent writers, period, male or female. Please welcome Joyce Carol Oates. Welcome. Glad to be with you again.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I thought maybe we could begin by talking about the new novel, The Falls. There's an old joke that was current when I was a young man because so many people went on their honeymoon, even then, to Niagara Falls. They said it was the second biggest disappointment after the honeymoon. And this novel begins with a honeymoon at Niagara Falls, which ends tragically. And one of the things that I'm prompted to ask you initially is, there's this whole scholarly paper by a man named Moses Blaine. It's written about people being drawn to the falls. Where'd you find this?
I invented it.
That's what I thought.
I couldn't find anything that would do quite the same things that I needed to do. I often write the epigraphs to my novels, but nobody has ever really called me on it except you.
Well, I think it's wonderful that I believed it because that's what fiction is supposed to make us do, of course, isn't it? But it begins there. In fact, I remember once asking you about place, and you were delighted to talk about the importance of place in your novels and in your short stories. And place is certainly important here, the falls. What does it mean to you, and why the falls?
Well, to me, because I grew up in western upstate New York, the falls, it has a very immediate significance because I saw it when I was a little girl, and I saw it in subsequent years, and so it's very real to me, very vivid. But it has an emblematic quality too, because the falls has come to symbolize one of the wonders of nature. If there's anyone in the audience who's never seen Niagara Falls, words really can't describe it. The Horseshoe Falls is just immense, and it's just astonishing. As you drive along the Niagara river is very swift, and the river is somehow very close to the highway, and so you sort of look over, and there's this rushing current. Just seems really, really extraordinary, almost supernatural. And then it rushes to the falls, and it is just extraordinary. In the winter time, the mist rises and it freezes into little bridges and things, so it has a kind of wonderland quality to it. And that natural wonder is one thing, but then the city of Niagara Falls, which was built, really industrialized in post-war America, particularly in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, becomes one of the industrial pollutants. So for me to write about it, I had the falls, which is a natural wonder, and then the city of Niagara Falls, both of which I knew fairly well because I lived in that area.
This becomes, it begins with this tragedy, and I'm not going to spoil the plot for anyone who hasn't read it, and I trust all of you will, but it moves into a kind of different realm in that it becomes a family saga, like the Mulvaney's, in some ways transgenerational family saga, and it also becomes an environmental story. And what's curious about that to me as a reader is how you move in your own sense of narrative fashion from one element to suddenly finding yourself with another element. I think, as I said, Terence Rafferty called it like a force of nature. It was like the falls almost aesthetically for him, experiencing it.
Well, it's interesting. I think that some women writers may be called forces of nature as a way of suggesting that the intellect isn't involved or any sort of aesthetic decisions. Believe me, that's not the case. I spend a lot of time revising and thinking very carefully about my work, and it's always structured in a certain way. So when, if you're called a force of nature, it's sort of like being a muse or something. But as I say, it's always pretty carefully calibrated. And in this novel, I began with a somewhat mythic, legendary fairy tale aura which seems significant in terms of the falls itself. And then we move through the decades and through another generation to the late 1970s, where the narrative gets a little more realistic. And all this is fairly carefully planned. When I write a family novel, I often begin with the first generation, a couple, and I deal with them when they're young, and then I begin to shift, the consciousness of the novel starts to shift to the younger generation, the children of these people, and then moving supposedly into the future. And it's a mimicry of the kind of evolutionary process.
Did you know you were going to go to Love Canal?
Oh yes, of course. Oh yes, of course. Because Love Canal, even the very word is kind of emblematic. Love Canal was not an actual canal, it was more like just a ditch. It was a long trench. It was going to be a canal, but it actually was never a canal. Well, Love Canal is antithetical to the falls, because Love Canal is filled with toxins and even radioactive pollutants. Whereas the falls has this image of being very pure and natural.
Speaking of pure and natural, many have tried, as I said, to characterize your work and fallen short. I think you yourself have characterized your work as realism, and you characterize yourself as a psychological writer. And yet someone like John Barth says her aesthetic, use that word again, is all over the map. I think that's a tribute to the versatility of your work. And you have written in so many different modes. You have written in so many different forms. Do you have what amounts to, or what even can be characterized as an aesthetic? Do you think of yourself?
Well, that's a good question. It's a question that nobody ever asks me, because people are always asking about plot, And there's nothing wrong with asking about plot and characters, but that's a very interesting question. I would call myself a formalist. I'm interested in the forms and structures of fiction and language, because that's the medium in which I work. And I love form. And when I teach at Princeton University, where I've taught for quite a long time, I give assignments to my students based upon certain genres, so that they're learning the different forms. So for me, the stories that come, we all are filled with stories. Our lives are brimming and simmering and shimmering with stories. Everybody has stories. The whole human race just has all these stories to tell. Some of them are histories, some of them are perhaps complete fathoms. And yet, what we need are forms to put them in. So the forms to me are very interesting. And when I have written a novel set in Niagara Falls, a novella called Rape, a Love Story, and that's also very formally devised in certain very short chapters. This novel is a family novel, and so it's much more expansive, and it deals with the decades, it deals with a number of issues that are political as well as personal, and so I need a certain structure for that. And I used to actually have maps on the wall, but I found that I guess I could just remember them as well as having them on the wall. So it's a spatial thing, and if you're writing a novel, it may be helpful just to plot it out so that you see it. If you have 3 sections, you want them to be in a certain symmetrical relationship. Like you wouldn't want one to be 500 pages long and the next 9 and the next 12, You have to have a certain symmetry there. And this is very exciting. If you're a formalist, the most obvious genre work is the sonnet. You all know what sonnets are. Well, maybe literally you don't. There's a Petrarchan sonnet and a Shakespearean sonnet, and they're actually kind of different. They look as if they might be the same, but they have a different rhyme scheme. If you're a poet, you're actually excited by forms. And you want to fill in the forms in a way that you hope is original and interesting.
Is something like the Gothic a form to you, or is it something that just finds expression from you, or the grotesque for that matter?
Well, the grotesque, the Gothic, and the surreal kind of all meld together in my imagination. They are taking a position of psychological realism, but pushing it as if we're in a dream world. You have to remember we spend many, many hours of our lives asleep. When we shift, when we lose our consciousness and we sort of go down beneath the threshold of consciousness, we're in a world which is real. It is real. Our brains are alive, and that's real. It's just that the consciousness, the level of rationality has been surrendered. And now we're in a world where there are many visual images and strange things, as if we're undersea in these strange thoughts now don't come as thoughts as they do in consciousness, but they often come as images, and it's like undersea creatures. And so we're in this different world. It's like Alice through the looking glass, or Alice down the rabbit hole.
I'm glad you mentioned Alice in the Looking Glass, and I'll tell you why. Because I read an essay where you said that when you were 8 years old, it had an incalculable effect on your inner life. And I always remember that phrase because I thought in reading The Falls, I remember when you remembering when you were 7 years old, seeing a body taken out of the Erie Canal. And I thought to myself, I wonder what Joyce Carol Oates is more influenced by in terms of her own imagination. The memory and the impact of that memory of being 7 years old and seeing a body taken out, that is the real, or the literary in a story by Carol that is taken into her inner life.
Well, when I was a child and given this book by Lewis Carroll, I was a farm girl in upstate New York, and this book that my grandmother gave me was illustrated, and it was really extraordinary. Just made such an impact upon my imagination. I memorized it. I could scroll through it if I wake up at 4 a.m. I could just sort of set my mind on Alice in Wonderland and sort of see, not just see the book and the photo and the drawings. I can actually see the little tears and stains in the pages that are in my book, because I still have the book. But the question about the real life experience, I'm not sure that I saw anybody being taken out. My father was in Lockport, New York, and I must have been with him, like he was driving. We lived 7 miles out in the country, and there were all these people standing around, and my father, I'm sure, went over there, and I came with him, I would guess. I would think I might have been older than that, and probably I didn't see anything, but my father would remember that I had been present, that somebody had committed suicide, probably. The Erie Barge Canal, as it goes through Lockport, is very deep, and the walls are stone, and it's very frightening looking. It is somewhat surreal. If you're on one of these high bridges and you look down, just the stone face when the canal, when the water level is low, and you sort of think to yourself, if I fell in there, how would I get out? You couldn't claw. You'd be clawing up this wall. It's kind of a nightmare situation. And I grew up around lots of water. Niagara Falls was 20 miles away, so it was a little too far for us to go very often. But I grew up around water, and there's always a stream or a river or a canal or a lake or something, and everything I write, I really don't feel quite right. You know, I just don't feel that things are quite right or normal without that going through.
I think the first interview we did was about Blackwater, the novel you wrote about Mary Jo Kopechne's death.
Yeah, well that's interesting.
But there's a sense in your work with the surreal and the uncovering of the unconscious that sometimes you feel you're in the looking glass, and sometimes you feel you're very close to the real. I mean, I know, for example, that you were very drawn to Lovecraft, and have written about H.P. Lovecraft, and so the sense of almost a kind of hallucinatory in your work is very strong, and yet the sense of realism is very strong too. That's why I asked the question about imagination as opposed to memory, and which affect you, or they affect you together, they come together too?
Well, I tend to be a realist in the longer works. I have written actually some Gothic novels, or some surrealist novels, but generally I like to write about realism. I think of the world of our reality as so complex and so exciting, and just, as I said before, sort of shimmering with stories. I don't feel we need to go in a science fiction direction or into an alternative world, because there's so much out there. And I love to do the research. Writing about Norma Jean Baker, who becomes Marilyn Monroe, for instance, takes us through a trajectory of a life that is so astonishing that we won't really have to go to Alice in Wonderland, because Marilyn Monroe had this fantastic life and it was all completely real. But then I feel a certain loneliness or a yearning, and as if I'm confined by realism. And then I'm sort of interested in working in the Gothic mode in a shorter form, maybe short stories. It's almost like a pendulum swinging. It might have this mimicry, it would just with daily life and then sleeping at night. When we fall asleep at night, if you're sort of falling asleep, almost the word falling suggests that you're falling through some sort of spatial dimension, your thoughts start to get more loose and sort of whimsical, and you can still be awake, but know that you're losing your grip on rationality. And it may be that we all need that, and that if you can't sleep and don't have that loosening of rationality, that it's not good for us. Because there must be some reason why we dream. Some people dream very potently and very powerfully. I think visual artists must. You look at the great paintings, say, of Van Gogh, for instance, and you just sort of see that the paint is so thick and it's so powerful. If you looked at the reality that these people were painting from, it would be a kind of ordinary reality that you could take snapshots of. But the canvases are just so vivid and swirling with color and texture, so that I would feel that these people are the great dreamers of our race, the visual artists, that they dream very powerfully and that they're enthralled to the dream life. I don't feel I'm enthralled to the dream life, but I'm fascinated by it, but I'm not enthralled to it the way a visual artist must be.
But you're drawn to the unconscious in ways that suggest the kind of thing that Lionel Trilling writes about when he talks about literary art, that making the unconscious conscious, or taking the kind of unconscious what normally would be a dream life and bringing it into consciousness and putting it and using artifice to do that is what literary art is.
Well, yes, I don't ever really do anything like that. I've only transcribed a dream once or twice in my life. It's very hard to do because the dream material is raw and it doesn't make sense in an aesthetic way. It's just too raw. It's like finding some scattered food on the floor and trying to make a casserole out of it, not really knowing what it is. It's actually better just to go out and buy your own ingredients. But I'm not a writer who works that close to the unconscious, but in my writing I can mimic, and I respect the techniques of the unconscious, so to speak. If I could think of a writer who is really very close to the unconscious, I'll speak of that person in a minute. I would think that someone like Kafka might be fairly close to the unconscious. We think so, but on the other hand, Kafka might have been a surrealist. He might have been choosing images with his conscious mind.
When you describe yourself as a formalist, though, it brings to mind, you know, formalism, when it's taught in a kind of formal way, removes the author from the text. And I think that many people are fascinated with what has given you the imagination and the gifts of your imagination, as well as the fruits of it. When you talked about Marilyn Monroe, for example, I was struck in remembering how much you identified your mother with Marilyn Monroe. And I was struck once when you said that there was death in your family, you didn't exactly understand, something had happened to your mother's father, and something had happened to your father's grandfather, and you didn't know the whole stories, but they were subliminal, kind of underneath the creaks in the floor or something like that.
That's right. That's so true. I think that's true with many children. You have a sense that something isn't being told, and quite rightly, because adults have to have their own secrets, you know. It's sort of around the penumbra of outside the lighted dimension of your lives, and there's this shadowy area, or some things are going on. And I think it leads some of us to write, try to compose, solve the mystery.
Do you ever have to really pry it, or is the well kind of always open for you?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer. I think it's a matter of having quiet time and being able to meditate and be alone. You can't do any artistic creativity if you're interrupted all the time, and if other people are making demands upon you. People ask how I write so much. Well, the most obvious answer would probably be that I didn't have children, because my friends who have children have a lot of intelligence and creativity. I mean, they may be tremendously fertile in their imaginations, but they haven't had the uninterrupted time that I have, because they've been good mothers and involved with their children. And even when they get older and the children are older, still, they're thinking about them. I didn't have that kind of tugging of my consciousness So that would seem to be the pretty obvious answer to why I was able to write so much. Then John Updike he says that he's accused of writing too much. I don't think I've ever seen any accusation of John. I mean, I'm accused of writing too much, but John is a man, so it's a little different. But John Updike and I, he says that we have in common, we're from working class backgrounds, and we have a work ethic. And I thought that was very interesting when John said, it makes a lot of sense. He and I come from a background of a work ethic. My parents would never be idle. They'd always be working. My father worked at 2 or even 3 jobs. It was what men did, men who grew up in the Depression. They needed to make money, and it was part of the whole ethic. Then my mother would never just sit without doing anything. She'd be knitting, or she'd be crocheting, or she'd be making some food, or she'd be sewing. I mean, this whole ethic of being busy, I find just delightful. My worst nightmare would be that I'd be put somewhere and I couldn't do anything. I couldn't work. To me, like being on vacation, people say go sit on a beach. You know, I just couldn't do anything like that. After 2 minutes, I would just get a feeling of wildness and despair. But at least when I'm running, I think when I'm running, you know, you're doing something at that. And I also like to do very mundane things like vacuuming at the house. I'm the only person in all of Princeton, New Jersey who does her own housework. And I've looked askance. But when I'm doing the housework or cleaning the carrots or making dinner, I'm thinking, because the manual effort is pleasurable, I think, in itself, but then it frees your mind up. So these are reasons why I would seem to be working more or writing more than other people. It isn't necessarily the case that I would be working more than other people if they didn't have the same life that I live. So it's kind of a convoluted answer.
But I'm fascinated by what you say, especially about the working class background. I happen to have lunch this afternoon, just coincidentally, with a friend of mine, Lillian Rubin. Some of the people here probably know. Writer and psychologist, and we both happen to come from working class backgrounds, and we're talking not only about the work ethic in conjunction with our lives, but also working and being overextended as a way of anesthetizing from depression.
Oh, well, that is interesting. Yeah, and depression is kind of a mysterious emotion or psychological condition. It's maybe not understood. They say that depression is anger turned inward. That's what they say. I mean, who really knows about that? And that mania and depression are sort of the opposite sides of the same coin. And the manic state is considered a positive state if you're an artist or a writer, because then you have a lot of energy. You can stay up all night working. But then the depression is the antithesis, and it's sort of coming down from that. But I like to work because, to me, the idea of work it's what I do. It doesn't feel like work. You're active. Let's put it this way: our species has brains that are geared to solve problems, and when we solve problems, we're happy. Some of us are solving problems of musical composition. Some of us are solving problems that are literally mathematical. Some are solving problems of how to create a vehicle or a rocket or something that will actually move, you know, that doesn't just crash, but it actually moves. These are problems that I couldn't solve. Some people are born investigators, they're born detectives, and some people are born gamblers, and they're solving problems very rapidly in their minds at the gaming table. And I wouldn't have any talent at all for that, or even any interest in it. And some people are athletes, some great boxers, for instance. Each fight that a boxer fights is a problem, and they work out a strategy, how they're going to deal with the opponent, what the opponent's probable moves are. Chess, for instance, is a good example of a game that is one problem after another, and the problems keep shifting and changing. And it gives immense pleasure to some people to do these things.
You're solving problems of form and language?
Well, everything I write, every paragraph and every sentence is a solving of some small problem. One is the sentence as a unit. Like, do I want a single sentence paragraph that has a certain beat or music to it? I want a paragraph this long or a paragraph this long, a page. To me, each one of these pages is kind of exciting. I mean, it probably sounds ridiculous. People are thinking I'm completely insane. But since you're asking these questions and nobody ever asks, and then I write poetry, and the way now all poets will tell you this, the blank spaces, the way you break, which line you break on, and where the stanzas are, the way it looks on the page is very important. Nobody else is even noticing this. The fact that William Carlos Williams has a kind of a skinny line going down the page, or 3 line stanzas, and it looks in a certain way, that's very important for him. C.K. Williams, a contemporary, has a very long line, so that sometimes his books may be printed, the poetry may be printed side like that. Walt Whitman has a long line, and Emily Dickinson has a very short line. You don't see them mixing that up. You're not going to see little short things from Whitman and a long line from Emily Dickinson. Those things are very much part of the personality and part of the form. And they're very exciting to the people who are working with them.
When you speak of these things, it sounds like fun. It almost sounds like play, and I imagine it is.
Play, it is, yes, it's difficult play.
But then, but the difficult side of it, I just wanted to emphasize for a moment, or italicize, because when you go into your characters, I'm thinking about the novel you wrote from the perspective of a serial killer, for example. I mean, you were deeply into that character. The many works that you've done where you're deeply into adolescent girls who are either suffering or in some cases just going through the kind of turbulence that, or being hit with things in their life that really represent a serious crisis. I mean, it seems like you're there in the consciousness and you're experiencing it, and to some extent, that must present some real pain, most potentially, doesn't it, rather than the pleasure?
Well, it's so filtered through the form that maybe it is a way of anesthetizing myself to the reality of it. That is a very good remark that you made, kind of provocative remark. We can get back to it in a minute. But you mentioned a zombie. A zombie, to me, is a novel in a certain form. It's a novella. Each chapter is short, and the zombie character is so different from my own self. I'm very intellectual and analytical. And I'm interested in the history of literature, and I teach. I've been teaching for a long time, so I don't have any problem analyzing and seeing. I was even trained as a philosopher. It was very serious and very influential minor. That English was my major and philosophy was my minor. And I'd like to read philosophy. Now, the zombie character you mentioned, Quentin P. in the novel called just Zombie, he's the opposite. He doesn't do any analysis. He has no self-awareness at all, and he has no interest in it. He sees people as part of his fantasy. He is a sexual predator, so he's always trolling and looking around for individuals to populate his sexual fantasy. Most of us, most of you, he wouldn't have any interest in at all. You're just blanks to him. There's nothing there. A few of you he'll look at and he'll have a little thrill, a little adrenaline rush, but it's not at all conscious. So when I was writing that novel, I had to get into the mind of somebody a little bit like, I mentioned these undersea creatures that sort of go along. They say sharks always have their mouths open, and they just are, and they never cease. They don't sleep, I think, they never stop, they just keep moving, and their mouths are open, and they're always ready to eat, you know. And the serial killer's trolling in the same kind of way, always looking for victims. And when the victim is sighted, then the effect is electric and physical and visceral, but it's not intellectual. And as I said, this is a personality so different from my own. I also get a very visual imagination because it comes through the eyes. It's not an intellectual thing. And the male sexual fantasy, I think, is true for heterosexuals too, not just this character, who you could say he was homosexual it's a way of, I mean, I don't want to insult homosexual men or gay men. He never thought of himself as gay. He had a predilection for boys of a certain age. And it isn't even that he was homosexual. There wasn't any ideology at all. It's just that this is the objects of his sexual fantasy. And so the novel has little crude drawings in it. And when I started writing it, just naturally I knew that he would do his little drawings. And they'd be kind of crude, just like childlike drawings, because that's the way his mind was. So I found it very, very fascinating to be writing from the point of view of that person so different from myself, who, when he sees a woman, somebody like me, he sees a blank. There's no interest there at all.
But you had distance from this character, even though you were assuming his mind and his sensibility.
Well, it's hard to say because a lot of it is projecting yourself into a person, maybe finding some subterranean connection. Because the connection between the serial killer who's a fantasist and the writer or artist who's also a fantasist is there. I think filmmakers are obvious fantasists. Let's take an example you would all know, Hitchcock. Many of you know the work of Hitchcock probably quite well. And if you do, you might also know that Alfred Hitchcock created his own movies in his head. He saw them in his head. He worked them through elaborately. There's never been any director so elaborate. He did drawings, and the movies existed in his head as fantasies. And then he turned to cast, you know, to get actors, to get sound people, to get makeup people, to get designers. And that part of it was not nearly so pleasant to him. He felt that now he had to compromise his idealism. He's a good example of a powerful fantasist who was not psychotic because he could transfer that powerful fantasy that made him a genius to the real world, and he starts casting people. Only once or twice, with Tippi Hedren, did the fantasy spill over. And you probably know, some of you, that he had an obsession with Tippi Hedren, one of his...
But he was allegedly cruel with a lot of the women actors.
He was cruel, but she was the one that he really went over. He crossed a line with her. He was actually probably a little bit insane with her. He lost his ability to draw back. Martin Scorsese is a powerful and very brilliant fantasist. All these people are, and some writers are too, obviously, they're fantasists, but they're not psychotic. I mean, they're functional, they're very productive people. The serial killer is a fantasist, and he's psychotic because he can't take the fantasy and then do anything with it. He's not part of a community. He's not going to paint a mural like Hieronymus Bosch with his grotesque, distorted nightmare images. He's not going to make a movie. He's not going to write a series of tales like Edgar Allan Poe. He's not going to do any of this. He's going to take real living people and make them into his fantasy. He's going to kill them. He's going to maim them. He's going to sexually exploit them. He's doing all these things that make him psychopathological and not an artist. Still, when I'm writing about somebody like that, I see a subterranean connection there. And that's the way I can get into that person who's a fantasist but not able to take it into the community.
An essay of yours, actually I think it was a speech that you delivered on violence, and you talked about how you had been in so many international situations, I mean, throughout the world, where people said, you know, why all the violence in your work? Yeah. And you reflected on this, and it almost sounded as if you were a little peevish about the idea that people should notice this in your work and highlight it, especially in places like Bosnia or, you know,
right, Berlin,
or, you know, places where violence is so rife. And that speaks to something in me as a reader of your work that says what you really want to do in some ways is to be, in the old-fashioned sense, didactic, to show your reader that this is what is. This is the realist in you again, isn't it?
Well, I think obviously this is the case, and when you look at history, history is a blood-soaked landscape, both in North America, all the Americas, and in Europe. And you don't need art you don't need art to blame, you know, for any kind of violence. The art may deal, well, let's take an example that you would all know, Shakespeare's great tragedies. There is violence in Shakespeare's tragedies, but it's very selective violence. It's the images and the way in which it's presented are very ritualistic, because art tends to be ritualistic rather than chaotic. Whereas over here you have history. Let's take the Holocaust, for instance. Complete insanity, cruelty that was systematic, unspeakable cruelty, but no art to it. Just this horror here. That's history, that's reality, that's the blood-soaked landscape. And then art is over here, and art takes just very little images. The Greek tragedies didn't even have any violence on stage. It was evoked through language. A messenger might run on and he would describe how somebody died off stage in vivid language so that one could understand it, but it didn't have to be present. And so that's the difference between art. When I'm asked why my writing is violent, it's a naive question because the writing's not violent. No writing is violent. Writing is language, and it's very artfully arranged. It may seem to be speaking of some violent acts, but probably there aren't very many in terms of the pages. 500 pages, you know, and 2 or 3 violent things happen in the whole novel. Whereas in real life, how many people are dying even as we speak? People die in automobile accidents, they kill one another with guns, they commit suicide. This is going on constantly in the real world. And so it seems very naive, and it usually is a sexist question too, because male writers would be much less likely to be asked that question, I think.
You mentioned Cormac McCarthy, for example. Why so much violence in your work being asked? It's almost imponderable.
I wonder if he is asked. I have no idea. He may not even be interviewed. He's kind of reclusive. But you just wouldn't ask Shakespeare, like, why is your writing so violent? You sort of look at, well, I'm writing formal tragedies, and tragedies have a way of ending in a violent, sort of a denouement. But the ritual of tragedy I mentioned a moment ago, and it's a ritual in my writing too, always ends with some promise of a new order, that there are literally bodies on stage in Shakespeare's tragedy. Literally there are bodies on stage. But then there'll be some younger person or a new prince or a new king or something who comes on, and there's a suggestion of an evolutionary principle there that Shakespeare is dramatizing. Then in my writing, I'm sort of a Darwinian evolutionary theorist, and I feel that the great drama of our human species is evolution, and that we're moving, we are somehow progressing, maybe not all of us at the same pace, and maybe not all parts of the world simultaneously, but I do feel that our human consciousness is progressing. Fits and starts, degrees, maybe some backsliding. I do feel that. You feel, essentially what Shaw and Nietzsche, who I know you admire tremendously, have said, that we're moving on a kind of creative trajectory in terms of evolution? I think we are. I know that it sounds... I mean, it's very hopeful. Yeah. Well, I think in terms of science, some people will immediately say, well, science is so negative, they've given us the nuclear weapons and so forth. But still, when you consider that medical technology today, just the 20th century alone, and who knows what the 21st century will bring, scientists and experimentation, and yes, I think the body of knowledge is always increasing. We must be vigilant that fundamentalists and people who are anti-intellectual don't take it back from us, because they seem always to want to do that in the name of their own blood consciousness. I talked about this with my friends who are astrophysicists and philosophers at Princeton, and we feel kind of sad because the world is locked in these blood consciousness turmoils where you have fundamentalist religions, each one of them claiming that God has ordained their religion to be the only religion. And it's basically blood consciousness and nation groups or tribal groups who want their DNA to prevail over others. And so they've given it a theological cast. And this is very sad to think that in the 21st century, you still have fundamentalist religions who basically demonize other religions and other people, and that they're still so powerful. To me, now that's very sad. And they are usually anti-scientific, they're usually anti-universal. They don't like the idea of a global consciousness because they believe in their own blood tribalism.
They're more scientific now that they want to get a hold of scientific weapons that can annihilate more.
And use them, but they don't have that feeling that we would hope that they would have feel of a brother and sisterhood of human beings. As I say, I'm friendly with a number of philosophers, and the philosophers with whom I talk are ethicists. They're old-fashioned. They're concerned with ethics. They're going back to Plato and Aristotle. That ethics presupposes a sort of humankind brother and sisterhood. Ethics shouldn't focus on a narrow nation group of one ethnic identity, but ethics should touch upon everybody.
So you're an ethical Darwinist?
Well, I'm Darwinist. Darwin's theories are very complex and not understood by many people. And most people, if you ask them about the survival of the fittest or natural selection, they won't really probably know what it means. I mean, people have vague ideas, and the whole concept of evolution is probably not that clearly understood. People think that it's devil's work or something. And I have a lot in my novel, The Falls. I have actually a lot about evolution in the beginning because it was considered such a problem with what we call fossil evidence, which was being discovered in the 19th century. If you were a Christian and believed in a literal Bible, then you had a certain set idea of how the earth was created in 7 days and 7 nights and so forth. And this was sort of locked into your consciousness. But then they were finding, by they I mean explorers and men of science and naturalists, some of them were women, but mostly were men. They would go out hiking and they'd find these fossils in shale in the earth, and the fossils seemed to predate. The animals that are fossilized are not living any longer. So it became evident that the age of the earth was much, much, much older than the Bible seemed to indicate. But if you were a serious Christian, this was a real conflict. Darwin himself knew that his findings would be so upsetting to society that he put off revealing them for many years. He only revealed them because pressure was put on him. He learned that somebody else was going to be coming up with some of the same theories. He had all this evidence, but he didn't want to publish it. We've sort of gotten off the subject that I think that we were on originally, but I'm so excited, or maybe made anxious by this idea that our ethical community is so challenged and so kind of put on the defensive by people who start talking about very narrow concerns. It's as if they wave a flag of an ethnic identity, and all that we keep working for in terms of world humanity is challenged and maybe even threatened by that. Don't you think this is
No, I share a lot of your
yeah,
sentiments
yeah.
and perceptions, and yet I'm struck by that sometimes I get a little more Spenglerian than I do as hopeful.
That things are winding down.
Pardon?
Yeah, that things are exhausting.
That entropy and things are winding down, exactly.
Well, I think women tend not to feel that way. Some women in the audience, we would say probably this is the best time for us to be living. In America, anyway. I think this is true. I started my novel off with Araya in the 1950s. That was a time when good women, and there are good women in this room, a really good, nice woman didn't know anything about sex. She was a virgin.
You call them good girls, I think.
They were good girls. They were terrified of sexual experience, so they never thought about it. Many of them didn't even touch their own bodies. They didn't look at their own bodies because that wasn't, quote, nice. And so women like that, like Araya, my poor Araya, I liked her so much. And she's 29 years old, and she's thinking, oh, I shouldn't feel this way, but I'm just dying to get married because she's a spinster. She said she'll get engaged, and the man himself is secondary. That was the 1950s. Women had very few options of occupations. They were desperate to get engaged because the man conferred respectability upon them. You could maybe be a kindergarten teacher or a grade school or a librarian. You had very, very few options, a nurse, a nun. You know, but you weren't going to be a doctor, you weren't going to be a judge, you weren't going to be a lawyer. You sure weren't going to be a university professor at Princeton or Harvard or Yale. I mean, forget it, you just weren't. And so your options were so small. That's why I say, for us today, even though it may not be perfect, it's not perfect for men either, but for women living now, for young girls who are in high school, this is a terrific time. So we don't have that sense, you know, that you may be alluding to. To spend
so it's a much better time thinking about who Uriah marries. It's a much better time for homosexuals.
Absolutely.
I mean, and I think you're trying to show that, aren't you?
Yes.
I mean,
oh yes, that's absolutely true too. Again, it's a challenge in some areas. There are parts of this country that are very fundamentalist and interpret the Bible in their own way and seem to lack a sense of sympathy for other people.
If you, a couple things, just to follow through a little bit on the violence, what is it that draws you to boxing? Because it is a kind of ritual of violence, and some would think it maybe takes us back to atavism and all of that. I happen to enjoy the kind of choreography and the aesthetics of boxing, as I suspect you do, but some, you know, feel it's a really brutal sport. What draws you to it?
Well, I have to say this interview is very good for me because it's giving me an adrenaline rush. I'm being asked questions that are ideological and not so personal, which is good. I've been talking so much about ideas, which thrill me very much. Well, boxing is this so quintessential masculine activity. Mike Tyson said he didn't think of it as a sport, but some sort of gladiatorial.
We've got Ali's daughter now. We've got all kinds of women boxers too.
Well, the women boxers are another category. But I was always interested in the history of boxing because it does have a history. Women boxers don't have a history, unfortunately, so I'm a little less interested in that. Boxing, like any other sport, maybe any other practice at all, has evolved, and the early boxers, the John L. Sullivan, and the early boxers moving into Jack Johnson, Joe Louis, and upward to Muhammad Ali. I actually think of, it's my evolutionary mode. Muhammad Ali is the high point. Muhammad Ali is a terrific boxer. Muhammad Ali does look back a little bit to Jack Johnson. He may have learned some things from Jack Johnson, the first black heavyweight champion who was fighting in the early 1900s. But Ali is kind of up there, and there have been other great fighters that other boxers try to emulate them. They really can't go beyond them, but they kind of look up to them. They're at the high point. And the technique and the form, all these things interest me enormously. It's the harnessing of masculine aggression, or maybe it's aggression that our species is born with, that men traditionally have dramatized more than women. The warrior ideal has traditionally been masculine, and most men are interested in war. I know men who have not fought in wars, but they read about wars. And I think young boys are tormented by the thought, are they brave enough? If they were drafted into an army and had to fight, are they going to be brave enough? These are not questions that women ask themselves.
Except I remember your novel Foxfire. There's a girl who becomes a kind of warrior, a putative
kind of
warrior.
An Amazon,
Yeah.
kind of Amazon, because she's sort of defending. But it's so rare. You know, I've had conversations on the subject with men who say that when they're boys, they think, would I be equal to it, or would I be a coward? And these are not questions that women ask. Now, women ask themselves different questions. They may ask, will I have a baby? Will I be afraid to have a baby? Will I be strong enough to have children? I mean, there are questions that that genders ask one another that make them, I think, equal in terms of courage. But for me, the idea of war is not appealing. I don't read war novels. I wouldn't see a war movie unless it's really very well done. Whereas my husband will read books about war. He loves to read about the Civil War. It's just obvious it's a gender choice. And I'm sure that most of the people who belong to the history book club, for instance, are probably men. But then when you come to mysteries, mystery and detective fiction, psychological thrillers, again, those break down into gender also. And mysteries, I think, are beloved by both men and women, and detective fiction. Then legal thrillers, then there are psychological thrillers, and they sort of go across the whole spectrum until you'll find something like the works by Tom Clancy that's mostly masculine. You know, and then you'll find another work by Mary Higgins Clark that mainly women read, and it was a detective. So there's a kind of interesting, I think, I find it interesting, I guess in an ideological way, that the genders have their predilections that way. And so boxing is very masculine. I first saw boxing matches with my father when I was just a young girl, 10 or 11, and there were very few other women and virtually no women or girls in the arena, hardly any at all. Women don't want to see their boys beaten up. It's very painful to see them, so they weren't really there. So I was ushered into a masculine world, and maybe that's why I became a novelist, because that world was so thrumming with surprises and newness and a kind of raw originality to me as a little girl, that naturally it became like a story that I would tell.
I remember Grace Paley saying to me that in the 50s, women didn't really think of themselves as storytellers. Or if they did think of themselves as storytellers, I mean, Flannery O'Connor and Dora Welty, obviously, but they weren't thinking of themselves as storytellers in the way she did when she created what she described as these kitchen dramas of hers and Little Disturbances of Man. And she said she had to extend her imagination initially, or tried to be a man, or to be like a male novelist. Audrey Rich has written about this too, and couldn't do it, and so was able to fall back. In some ways, I see your career moving more toward an integration of whatever those mean, masculine and feminine.
Well, I'm probably much more androgynous than some of the other women writers. I write equally, with equal interest about men or women. I feel I can identify with men to some degree. I mean, if you're writing fiction, it's just as hard, I think, to create a believable woman character if you're a woman than it is to create a male character. That's always been my feeling.
I can't tell you how many male writers say they have a much harder time creating a woman character. Flaubert and others notwithstanding.
I know, they feel that way. Well, some of it's just personality, too. And some of it's a feeling that they're not as engaged by the female, or they feel a lack. You know, when John Updike writes from the point of view of a woman, just feel he's holding back. It's not quite the fullness or the richness that you get in his other characters. D.H. Lawrence, though, was just brilliant. He writes brilliantly about men and women both, and animals, actually. He's a writer of genius.
Some say it's because of his homoerotic feelings.
Well, he's bisexual.
Yeah, especially in something like Lady Chatterley, where he is getting a little bit overly phallocentric, but that's another digression.
He was I think he was bisexual, just naturally
right,
bisexual.
Yeah.
He had an erotic feeling and sympathy and love for lots of things. Like, he has poems about turtles and rabbits and Crete and horses, you know, wonderful, wonderful poems. Just a kind of sympathy for the isness, the actualness. It's not a sexual feeling, but it could maybe be called an erotic feeling. Some people feel that way about animals. They just love them. They love animals. I've seen documentary you've all seen about Coco, the gorilla. You've probably seen this many times. Coco,
a neighbor of ours, Palo Alto.
Well, she's famous. She's a famous gorilla, and the photographs are famous where she's holding a little kitten, you know. And it's kind of like trans-species love, but it's not sexual. And I think that D.H. Lawrence had that magical sympathy, which I would hope that I could emulate too. I'm just naturally sympathetic with other people. They could be men or women or children or elderly people or whatever. Because I feel, obviously, they're there. They're alive, you know. They have a point of view, and it's not my point of view, but it's very respectable and very justified. So I got kind of excited to see the world from that other point of view. My own point of view I know, and it doesn't interest me nearly as much.
So before we go to questions from the audience, and I hope you won't be very complimentary and that's appreciative about the questions you've received from me this evening. I hope you won't think this fatuous is a kind of final question, but I've always been meaning to ask you this, and that is what you would take from your work if you had to select just, say, a few works to put in the proverbial space capsule or whatever. I mean, it would be your legacy. I'm sure it's an onerous and difficult question, but have you thought about that, what you would select?
Well, if it's a question of form, and which were the most interesting novels in terms of postmodernist form, then that's one answer. Or if it's a question of characters who are kind of lovable or people can identify with the characters, that's a different question. So postmodernist form, the novel that interests me the most in terms of the formal structure is absolutely Blonde, by far. That was my most difficult novel, and it's so carefully, it's so almost ornately put together that it really interests me enormously. Then another long novel called What I Lived For, which is another, it's very carefully put together. I mean, these novels are really very carefully put together. The Falls is carefully put together, but it doesn't have the postmodernist, it's not difficult. This is not a difficult novel to read. Blonde, I think, might have been difficult to read. It was basically a movie being narrated by somebody from beyond the grave, a posthumous novel, but it was postmodernist, and by postmodernist I mean it's very experimental and playful. It's not literal realism. Then a novel like We Were the Mulvaney's, which is a family novel. I love that novel because my cat is in it, some of my childhood background is in it. I mean, there are novels that I love for different reasons. A place where my mother lived, you know, or somebody who has experiences like my mother, or something like my father. All these novels have little things in them. So it would be really hard to choose.
I lied. Just one other quick question before we go to the audience. Is this title, you said you began with kind of a mythic notion of this latest novel of yours. Are you thinking like pre-lapsarian? Because you were talking before about, it sounded like Genesis, the Falls, meaning the falls of mankind and all of that too.
Well, it certainly would lend itself to that kind of emblematic way of thinking. The Falls meaning the fall from Eden, if we believed in Eden. Say North America before it was Columbus Day, so this is not a very coincidental. Say North America was some sort of a garden, a natural garden, and that the Native Americans who were here were going to preserve it in a way different from the way Europeans might deal with it. So then we have a fall from that kind of pre-European history. And then when Columbus comes and when it's settled, it's the nation is settled in such a way that it seems it's being conquered, you know, where there are predators who are coming in from Europe and they're decimating the Native American population or putting them on reservations or committing genocide or whatever they thought. They didn't say that they were doing. But anyway, you could argue that there was a fall there from some sort of innocence. I think this might be a very naive way of speaking. I don't think that the Native Americans, because they were human beings, were probably any less given to rapacity or cruelty to their so-called enemies than Europeans. I know this is not a politically correct statement to make. I tend to feel that Homo sapiens is aggressive, and that here and there you may have tribal people who are more pacific. They're not as warlike as others. Some are really bellicose in terms of history, but I think that Homo sapiens probably is equipped with the same kind of instincts for possession and wanting to replicate their own DNA. So I'm not a person who thinks that one group was completely innocent and the other group is completely sinful. But I think, as history would tell it, the Europeans obviously were rapacious and they did treat the Native Americans very, very badly, and probably are still doing that, and sort of paying them off with casinos here and there, kind of guilty, you know.
Let's bring the lights up, and we're going to go to you in the audience who have questions. Raise your hand and we'll come to you with a microphone. And And when the microphone comes to you, speak up and speak loudly and ask any question or make any comment that you have for Joyce Carol Oates.
Hello. Hi. Your short story, Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? You say is for Bob Dylan, and I've always been curious as to why it's such a chilling story.
Well, that's a good question. I wrote the story so long ago that Dylan was in a phase where he was writing music like It's All Over Now, Baby Blue. And that song and some others on that same album were rather like fairy tales, and even like nursery rhymes that had gone wrong. He had taken a kind of simplicity of imagery and linked it to a kind of Gothic cautionary mode. And I thought that was just perfect for what I was doing also. So I dedicated it to Bob Dylan, but that was really the end of it. You know, there wasn't a prevailing sense that Bob Dylan meant anything more to me than something at that time. I mean, I can't claim that I know about Dylan's subsequent career the way many people do. I haven't followed it. It was mainly that early phase of Dylan that I liked very much. And I know he has had other phases, and he's a brilliant composer.
Just published the first volume of his autobiography.
And I read part of that. I read part of that. It was excerpted and very interesting.
I read something that stayed with me where he said, if you want to become a writer, you don't have a life. But we could do a whole
That was very interesting. He said when he writes his songs, he thinks he's living. And that's part of his life. And when he was writing, he felt he was withdrawn from life. That's because he's not a natural writer. He's a natural songwriter and a musician. But if you're a writer or an artist, you know, whatever you are, when you're doing what you were born to do, you feel that you are alive.
Hi. I've not heard a prose writer before talk so much about the impact of the words on the page, the visual impact of them, or like the presentation, if you will. And I wondered if that's something when you're writing, if you're visualizing it as you're writing to take that form on the page, or if it's something you impose afterwards when you're rereading or editing.
Well, I think it's a good question, and all of us have slightly different imaginations, and some people in this room are probably very, very visual, and that's your orientation. I think I am kind of intellectual and psychological, but then I have the visual, maybe the yearning, you know, because I love to look at art. I really am enthralled by art and by photographs, but I don't create that. So probably what I'm trying to do is some emulation of that. But I have a lot to do with the jacket designs in my books and with the covers. That's something that I can somehow guide that to some extent. But the way the words look on the page can have its own beauty, and it's maybe like incantatory or talismanic or magical. There's a poem in one of the first, maybe the first chapter of Alice in Wonderland, which you all maybe know. It's the mouse's tale told by a cat. It's about a cat that chases a mouse, and the poem is on the page. First it starts off with the letters are fairly big, and then they get smaller and smaller, and it turns into a mouse's tail. So that was the first poem I ever saw. And it was visual and arresting and playful and funny. Fairies said to a mouse that he met in the house, we will both go to law, I will persecute you, and it goes on like that. And then it ends, he condemned him to death, and the word death is really little. And when I saw that, like most children, you know, the idea of death to children is very abstract, but the idea of being eaten is not so abstract somehow. Children can have fantasies that they may be eaten, like the big bad wolf will gobble you down. But maybe this early poem that I saw in the children's book, maybe that made a real influence on me.
Next question.
I have two questions. I'm curious why, well, I have my own idea, why you used the name Rosamund Smith for your psychological thrillers, And second, do you ever write a novel, maybe We Were the Mulvaney's, based on a germ of an idea or concept that you heard from another family that you were intrigued by and elaborated on?
Okay, let me take the second question first, because I can kind of formulate an answer to that. Yes, We Were the Mulvaney's had a number of components that make it very close to my heart. I like to think of writing a novel as like a river with these tributaries going into it, and you need a number of very small tributaries to make that river run. Otherwise, it's just this shallow little stream with trickles, and it doesn't generate any power. But one strand of it, which is a little too personal for me to talk about in a public place, had to do with my father as he aged and became, well, you know the whole mode of King Lear, where a person gets older. It doesn't have to be a man necessarily. And some of the personality starts to shift. I don't mean senility. I don't know what I mean. It's sort of, King Lear is the best example. When King Lear he's got so much power, and he's not able to be rational. He flies into these furies. He vanishes Cordelia, who he loves very much, and he makes all these mistakes. He's very angry because he knows, at least unconsciously, that he's coming to the twilight of his life. And instead of being gracious about it and sort of signing off and retiring, taking early retirement, let's say, he's sort of hanging on to things, and he's blustering. And my father wasn't like that either, but there was an element in my father that I understood he was changing. And it just frightened me so, that the man I knew all my life was changing. And some of what was changing was his feeling toward me. And I understood it was because he was aging and ill, and that it was a kind of depression of old age. We must all know, when people get older, they're so traumatized, I think, by the physical ailments that are happening to them, that they start to lose some of the magnanimity and generosity that they had when they were younger. And then people in their family are just thrown for a loop. They can't believe, that grandma's not so nice anymore, or grandpa's crabby, or it just throws us all for a loop because we've been children so long. You can be a child when you're 50 years old. And so I was working with the nightmare feeling that a father would vanish a daughter. The material is so upsetting to me that my eye is twitching now. I hope nobody can see it. I mean, I think I'll just sort of move away from this. It's a sudden nerve that's twitching in my eye, so it's a signal to me that I shouldn't be talking about that. So anyway, there's that, the King Lear, and King Lear was a fairy tale too, in the way he banishes Cordelia. That's in my novel, The Daughters Banished. Then my closest friend, whose name I actually could make public. She's a feminist, and she probably wouldn't mind, but I think I won't do it. So I don't want to seem to be exploiting someone who is kind of well-known on her own. She was rejected and disowned by her family for marrying outside their religion when she was about 20 years old. And her family literally disowned her. It may have even been a religious ritual that they went through. She was banished 17 years, and they didn't see her. They didn't acknowledge her. It was like she had died. And I found this a very touching story. And then when her father got ill and he died, then she came back to her family. She forgave her mother and her sister, who had been really cruel, really nasty to her. She forgave them, and ultimately she gave a lot of money to her mother, who was elderly. I was so impressed with my friend. I was so impressed with her generosity toward these people who had been cruel to her. I just thought, this is terrific, that's so generous. And then she also told me that because her family had been so cruel to her, and by the way, she married a wonderful man. Her husband's great, and it was ignorant, I think, what they did. But because she had been treated so cruelly by her parents, she was determined to be the best mother ever. And she had 2 children, and she is the best mother ever. Now, I was so struck by this because it would be the recipe or the formula for a woman being bitter because her family had been mean to her, her mother cast her out. She could be nasty to her own children. She could have been nasty to the whole world. But my friend wasn't. She was so generous. She's famous at Princeton for being very generous to with her students and with her friends. This made a strong impression on me. So when I wrote We Were the Mulvaneys, I created characters that were equal to these people, who were really good people but strong people. They were stubborn people. They were not perfect. They made mistakes. But they had a magnanimity of spirit that I really, really respected.
You know, we started out talking about a family novel, and we concluded with one. And those of you who are here tonight will have an opportunity to have Joyce Carol Oates sign her new novel, The Falls. And I want to extend thanks for a delightful evening. It's always so much pleasure to talk to you, and I know for the audience to hear you. Thank you all.